By the end of this year, the marketplace of ideas will become a thing of the past. Of course, unless we get 10,000 podcast subscribers by then, in which case it'll be a thing of the present, and of course, a thing of the future beyond that. Want to help? Well, we need 252 new subscribers this week. You can find out more by joining the Marketplace of Ideas mailing list. Go to colinmarshallradio.com. There on the front page of the Marketplace of Ideas site, you'll find instructions on how to join and how to help the count get to 10,000 and the show stay on past 2011 and deliver more in-depth cultural conversation every week, maybe even more frequently. We'll see. All depends on if we can get to 10 grand. So you hear people talk colloquially, about two kinds of art forms. They talk about modern film and they talk about modern literature, and they throw around that term modern a little bit loosely, but it seems to refer to two sort of consistent traditions or trends or styles in film and in literature. But do you think modern film, quote unquote, and modern literature, quote unquote, have things directly in common besides the fact that people use the word modern to talk about them?
Well, I think modern is a different kettle of fish for both of them than experimental.
Right.
I think probably the thing that modern or modernism, that both modern film and modern literature share is interest in experiment with forms, but still an interest in narrative. And I think postmodernism, certainly in literature, doesn't always have either of those. I think that sometimes postmodernism isn't always experimental in form. There's certainly a lot of postmodern fiction that isn't necessarily interested in narrative. I think a lot of postmodern literature might even consider itself post-narrative. I think both modern literature and film still believe in themselves, in almost their sanctity, the sanctity of literature or the sanctity of film. That, again, I think sometimes postmodernism gets away from.
From KCSB in Santa Barbara and Colin Marshall Radio, this is the Marketplace of Ideas. I'm Colin Marshall, and I'm speaking with Jeffrey DeShell, Associate Professor of English at the University of Colorado, Boulder, and the author of 5 novels, the most recent of which is Arthouse from Fiction Collective 2, which combines these two kinds of forms, two forms or two ways of using form in film and literature that I have long been interested in. And if you listen to this program, I'm sure you have as well, listeners. Now, I know these things can only be pinned down so far, but what are the roots of your own motivation to try to draw something out of your interests in film, out of the film that intrigues you, and bring that to text, to literature?
Sort of the impetus for this book has somewhat to do with, there's a scene in a Buster Keaton film, Sherlock Jr., where the famous scene where he sort of gets caught in different film or a film that keeps cutting, and he keeps getting bruised by the rocks,
right,
and then falls into the ocean. And that was sort of interesting to me, how someone could actually get trapped within film. And so I was interested in perhaps using that thinking to try to structure a book. I'm not very good at coming up with plots sometimes for my novels, so I need help.
Does it matter if you can't come up with them? I mean, I don't know what your philosophy on this is as far as literature, but plot, just steal one. And then
no, that's what I do. I mean, I'm constantly stealing. The other there's another axis for Arthouse, and that is the Faulkner novel Sanctuary, where two characters sort of get caught in a distillery, and so I sort of stole that as well. So no, I'm quite happy to steal, but I do need help sometimes, sort of getting going. And so whatever I can use, film or Faulkner, I'll all do.
And
then after I sort of decided to do that, it's amazing how much, for example, film not only structured the structure, but certainly structured what was happening as well. And that part of discovery I really sort of enjoy.
Now, Sanctuary, not usually the Faulkner novel you see assigned in school.
For a number of sort of, I guess, corncob reasons. But I sort of stayed away from that. But just the basic sort of premise of it.
And I know to a certain listener, hopefully to a lot of them, if they're anything like me, they will be tantalized by my giving a few of the names of the films that inspire parts of your book. And of course, they are the chapter headings. You name the films that the professor, this character, is being trapped within. We have Branded to Kill, Grand Illusion, Tokyo Story, Fellini Satyricon, The Conformist, Contempt. There's a selection. I mean, I feel like some of these names, these films are what someone might call classic art house films. And I put both classic and art house in quotes because both of the terms I feel like I'm on shaky ground with. But then there's some names, there's the good, the bad, and the ugly, which I don't see get called an art house film. And there's movies like, and I'm trying to pin one down here on the list that doesn't quite, Texas Chainsaw Massacre would be another example of a film that people don't necessarily frame in art house terms, but I guess they can?
I do think they can. I'm a little unclear about what people watch anymore. I was going to give a reading at the university, and there's a section in Thunder Road, which probably is another one that one wouldn't necessarily consider art house.
Right.
And I was going to give a reading. It's in a section where the two of the characters are discussing Bette Davis, and I looked out to the students, to the audience, and they're mostly students, and who's going to know who they might know who Bette Davis is, they might have heard of Bette Davis, but to think of an actual discussion about Bette Davis would probably not be terribly interesting to them. So I think that perhaps these distinctions might be, and I think probably are, important to some, and I'm wondering if those distinctions are sort of blurring into a generalized sense of quote-unquote film history. I don't know. I think that's a good question. I think that, Texas Chainsaw Massacre certainly could be considered, a type of art house, as perhaps the good and the bad and the ugly.
It is fascinating because a film program that I go to often in Los Angeles, Cinefamily, they were screening the Texas Chainsaw Massacre alongside some more sort of some more, I don't want to say stereotypical, but some more art house films. And when I say art house, we should really get this clear because we're going to be sort of stumbling around this term a lot if we don't. But I've had trouble as a cinephile with the word art house because I see it applied to some of my favorite films, and I see it applied usually semi-derisively. Only rarely is it truly positive for someone to say something is an art house movie. And I notice it's never the people who watch the movies who say art house. So tell me, what is your own perspective on the term art house besides the fact that you thought it might make a good title for this novel?
Yeah, that's mostly it. I think probably it would be similar to what one consider experimental fiction or literary fiction, although those are very different terms. I understand that, but maybe we should stick with experimental. I think some people would consider experimental almost a badge of honor or are not bothered by the term. I think probably both art house and experimental on some level are sort of applied after the fact. I mean, people just make films, right? And people just write books.
Right.
And then comes the sort of marketing and the sort of distribution questions. I think obviously their audiences in mind, but sometimes one can be wrong about audiences, and one can be wrong about one's place or one's communication with audience. Art house, I just like the name, and I needed a title, and I was going to sort of riff on that Buster Keaton title, but that didn't sound very good. So I don't consider it a negative by any means. I guess maybe I would just oppose it to, or it's just a shorthand for the opposition to, more popular film, just as I would consider experimental in opposition to more popular literature. But there's no other reason for those choices, I guess.
Now, here's the thing. Even for all my attitudes about the word art house, and for all I think, I wish people wouldn't use that word, it still got me to open your book. I mean, I still picked it up. So ultimately, the effect is still, maybe it's sort of a tribal effect. It's like if I see the word art house, I think, art house, unfortunate term, but I'm still going to look into this because it's probably about something I'm into.
Yeah, I wasn't aware of the sort of negative connotations of it because to me, growing up without an art house,
yes,
it was never negative to me, and so I wasn't aware of the negative connotations.
Well, negative overstates it, I think, when I say negative, but
or suspect maybe.
There is something fascinating in the usage of the word, and I swear I'm not going to ask so much about the title through this whole conversation, but the word art house, I mean, it's got the word art in there. You think of art house theaters as being separate from other movies, the implication there being, and I suppose what I take issue with is that these films are art, not those films.
Right.
Is that something you see in that term?
No, actually, where I thought you were going is that I sort of like the word house as well, and especially during the second to the last chapter, whose name is just escaping me, so I'm going to have to look. I'm sorry, the third to last chapter, the Conformist. I was very interested in architecture, and when I went to the Contempt during the Contempt chapter, when I went to the Casa Malaparte. I mean, I was the sort of space of the film became very important, and the architecture. I'm sorry, the space of the book and the architecture of the book became very important. So that's the part of the house that I sort of like, the art house. As far as the art part goes, I guess, I do consider these films art in the sense that I think all of them are very unsettling. Even the sort of more Hollywood films on the list are very unsettling and useful, I guess, to sort of riff on and read in a way. And so that art part, I'm not uncomfortable with.
Right. It's certainly I don't mind calling certain films art because, I always would do that. But then it's always like, I think it's the arguments I get led into, because if you call some films art, you imply that another film isn't art. And I always wonder, if I call The Conformist art, a film that I love, am I then calling a film that I don't like so much, say Transformers 2, am I calling that not art, or am I just applying the word art to things I like? I try to be safe and just call all films art, but then I lose the usage of the term art house, except for the whole house bit, to distinguish anything. You know what I mean? Yeah, no, I do know what you mean, and I'm not uncomfortable with that. I mean, and one of the things I try to do a little bit. I mean, the one movie I dislike that I wrote on is A Man and a Woman, and that song I really hate. And so I was trying to. I mean, and that's the inclusion of that chapter is important to me, because it shows, in some ways it shows, I won't say the professors, but certainly the narrators perhaps, or the voices limits, because it's a very sentimental movie. The song is very sentimental, and if you're going to pick movies, you want to pick, just like anything, if you want to pick things, or if you want to base your life on things, you need to base your life on less problematic things, or perhaps less sentimental things. Indeed. And in the chapter that follows, which we've mentioned, the chapter on The Conformist, I mean, for those who haven't watched The Conformist, it's a Bertolucci film from 1970, and it's, I always enjoy watching it because, on a basic level, even beyond any of the inner qualities that it has, any of the qualities of construction, it's a film that simply to look at, the look and feel of it is like, I can't stop watching it very, very intently and intensely, just because it's one of the best looking films I think I've ever seen.
Oh yeah, it has a great dance scene.
Indeed.
That woman has a wonderful dress, whose name is escaping me. That dress where they kiss at the beginning, and it was filmed in this very interesting suburb of Rome, the EUR, where that that Mussolini built, and it's so a lot of it is white marble and just sort of Roman-like or sort of faux Roman, faux classically Roman sort of architecture, but it's huge. I mean, a lot of the things are huge, but it's a very interesting and cold sort of suburb that is not usually on the tours, but it's a very great place to go because it's of the monumental and sort of cold quality. But you can see you can see Bertolucci and the hat he wears. That sort of fedora. I think is terrific.
And given the sort of primacy, at least to my mind, of the visual element of that film, when you're taking that film and you're trapping your protagonist into it, and you have to convert elements of this film into text so you can use it in Arthouse. I mean, you completely lose the ability to use any of the visuals from the movie directly. So it's like, was it like a moment of, well, now what do I use? Or did you have an idea of what you wanted to use that wasn't that beautiful surface?
Well, there's a couple of things. I tried to focus on architecture in that film, and I sort of, I think some tedious, I won't say tedious, sort of longish descriptions of architecture perhaps are a little bit problematic. But I actually took the title almost literally, and made him a conformist. I mean, and so there's a couple of things that he says that he can that he then sort of takes back, or I draw a line around them. Draw a line through them in order to make his sort of conformist, his conforming literally. So that was one of the riffs I tried to do with that film, because you're right. I mean, it's almost impossible to try to translate.
But yet you have the concrete in, as you said, in terms of the architecture. And as far as directors who are of the concrete go, I can think of no one more than Béla Tarr, whose film Sátántangó is the entrapping film. That's the entrapping film in Chapter 2. And recently on this program, we talked to another novelist, Lars Eier. Béla Tarr came up much in that conversation.
I saw that, yeah.
So it's clearly this is a thread that's going to connect these. But we talked about him in terms of him being an auteur of the concrete. He is the least abstract man ever to make a film, that sort of thing. But you can sort of, I'm just going to take a guess. When I read your chapter, that comes through very, very clearly. It becomes almost an Oulipo novel, doesnn it? Where it's
Béla Tarr is, there are a couple of things I got from him, and one was pacing. Obviously, right? It's just, and it really, his pacing is so slow, and so, slow but rhythmic, but it makes you really pay attention to the visual, because oftentimes nothing else is going on. The camera will slowly pan from the barn to the cows to another sort of destroyed wall, and it's pretty amazing.
Right.
And so I was trying to sort of get the pacing and the focus on the external and the surface in that chapter. But another thing I learned from Béla Tarr is, Sátántangó is incredibly narrative, but it's not psychological.
Right.
That's a real trick, to have a strong narrative. You care about what's going to happen to the characters, but you're interested in what's going to happen next. You follow them. There's a real engagement there, but I don't think it's a psychological engagement. And to have a narrative that isn't psychological, that's a real trick, and I've never sort of seen it before, either in literature or films. Probably film would be more of it, but it's a real, to me, it's a real interesting sort of predicament or a technique, I suppose.
And in the chapter, in the Sátántangó chapter, you have to use, because of all the concreteness, you have to use so many cardinal directions and so many objective words to make an actual concrete image in somebody's head. So to get that across, it takes a lot of description, and a lot of description in a non-psychological way. And I don't know if you thought about this while writing, but getting over the challenge of people not being trained or not being practiced in the art of creating such specific images in their head. That often I hear using those directions as a rule not to do when you're writing a novel because people won't be able to keep it in mind. So is that something you had in mind writing? Like, I got to get around that challenge? Or was it like, well, we're going to have a chapter where the rules get broken?
Well, no, I don't consider them rules. I mean, I consider them... that chapter was... There's also some, I guess, nouveau roman. There's also some Robbe Grillet and some, that objective narration, and also a distancing. I mean, there is a disruption, and it's for all the description and for all the description, it's hard to get it's hard to follow. I understand, I understand that, and for all the description, it's not very descriptive. Or it simultaneously disrupts description, I guess, as well, because it doesn't allow you that easy comfort of really easily and quickly imagining what's going on. The language gets in the way, just as I think in Béla Tarr, there is some self-consciousness there, or at least when you're watching it, you don't watch it easily, even though you're seduced by it. There's also your clock is ticking. How long is he going to keep this scene? And so there's I think there's a disruption there as well. So I'm not saying that I sort of mimed it well, but those were the rules I guess I set out for myself, or the game I was trying to play.
And we should explain to the listener that each of the chapters, or at least most of the chapters in this book, take a visually different textual style. I mean, you can tell, even if it's just by sort of the way the paragraphing works, or if it's something more radical than that, you can visually identify each chapter, each of which has a different movie as its sort of aesthetic source. And hearing about this novel, I would have thought that more of the chapters would take on a screenplay format, but that only happens in the Fellini Satyricon chapter. So what brought you to that form, the form we all associate with films directly without having to think about it, in specifically the Satyricon chapter?
I think that it's also because the subject matter is so emotional. I think that's also a way of objectifying and making it self-conscious and making the reader realize that, okay, even though this is a film, this is taking the form of a film script, which sort of eliminates, or at least sort of tries to what's the word I want? Tries to take away some of that overt sentimentality of the narrator or the character putting his mother in a nursing home. So that was a reason for that. It was just a way of how my question was, how do I given the constraints of the actual writing of the novel, how can I best write these films or rewrite these films or write a riff on these films and not copy something I've already done. What problems does the film and the chapter present to me, and how can I solve that?
And it becomes an issue then of setting interesting problems up for yourself. I mean, I'm sure you had many more candidates for films to write than these. So did that become a criterion to say, well, I want to pick the films that provide me with the most interesting challenges as a writer, but also interesting challenges as a reader? Mostly
it was a combination of films that I felt I needed to write on for some reason, and films that then would fit the plot somehow. And sort of sometimes it was trial and error, but sometimes it wasn't. Sometimes I sort of allowed the film to sort of lead me to plot points. Sometimes I had a plot point, and so I had to pick the film to do it. But it wasn't. It was neither one nor the other. It was a sort of combination of both. And I didn't start. A lot of it had to do with, okay, what's next, and I didn't have ideas. I mean, for some of them, I knew I had to write on, but a lot of times I didn't really know in chapter 8, where I was going to go to chapter 9. Oftentimes.
Now, there's a somewhat unusual choice for this context, then, with Seijun Suzuki's Branded to Kill, the late 60s Japanese gangster movie it's gotten plenty of credibility in sort of the world of like Criterion Collection type viewers, of which I consider myself one because of its techniques. But why did you feel you had to write about Branded to Kill?
It's a weird, lurid movie, I guess.
Yes.
And it's very self-conscious. There's some, to my mind, incomprehensible things about it. The rice that he keeps smelling, that, and I tried to include some of it, the bird with the nail through its throat, the whole, that entire, that woman's apartment. There's just a lot of just oddness to it that I was incredibly attracted to. And a lot of sort of sexiness to it that I also was incredibly attracted to. So I guess that was not a difficult choice. I mean, that was one I felt I had to put in.
And so, no matter the film that is the entrapping film of the chapter, as I've called them, we do have the professor. And this is fascinating to me because I didn't read the back cover copy of this book until I had read the book. Usually I try to avoid the jacket flaps and all that, all the text you see elsewhere. But I read the book, thought about the professor, and then saw the professor referred to on the back as a 40-something failed film studies academic, which may be this like one of the saddest string of words I've ever read.
That's true.
So is that I guess I want to find out how you came to that type of character, how that would be the guy you wanted to trap in these movies. Somebody for whom movies have been an engine of existence and a torment at the same time.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good way to put it. It is an engine. It is an engine and a torment. And he had. To my mind, he also had to be a meth cook.
Yes, yes.
And that goes back to the Faulkner. He couldn't be a real film, sort of a successful film professor if there is such a thing. I guess I made him a failed one, and 40-something I find perhaps a more interesting age than, certainly at least for this book, than 20-something, or even 30-something.
Right. Now, there's an issue of source material here because, as I mentioned before, you were a professor at the University of Colorado Boulder in the English department, so I don't know if you did any sort of anthropological resource over in the film department, or if you got any inspiration from any colleagues in film, or was this a complete invention? You had to ground up build a film studies academic?
No, I built a film studies academic. I also tried reading film criticism, which I found some of it particularly difficult, and other particularly not very interesting. But I found some that I tried to get the jargon, but I didn't find the film criticism easy to read, I guess, or easy to understand. But no, I did research. I didn't do sort of anthropological research because the film critics I know are very different from this personally.
Right. I would imagine, of course, by definition, nobody seems to be like the professor by the time I finish this book,
Yeah, but not even anywhere close, I suppose. So, no, it was more trying to get some of the language down and perhaps some of the way he'd think, which I don't think I did a great job of. I think probably he'd have a different language than a slightly different language.
If you've just tuned in, this is the Marketplace of Ideas, and I'm Colin Marshall. My guest is Jeffrey DeShell, Associate Professor of English at the University of Colorado at Boulder, and the author of many novels, the latest of which, Arthouse, synthesizes avant-garde literature and avant-garde film, or experimental literature and adventurous film, or adventurous literature and experimental film, or modern film literature, however you want to put it. If you want to hear the show again, visit colinmarshallradio.com or iTunes and search for the Marketplace of Ideas. Either on iTunes or colinmarshallradio.com, you will find the complete Marketplace of Ideas interview archive, always, of course, completely free. Questions, comments, feedback of any kind, guest suggestions, whatever you've got, send that along to Colin, C-O-L-I-N, at colinmarshallradio.com. And if you'd like weekly updates on all things Marketplace of Ideas, simply join the Marketplace of Ideas mailing list. Find the details at colinmarshallradio.com as well, right there on the front page of the Marketplace of Ideas website. Very simple stuff. Now back to the conversation about Arthouse. with Jeffrey DeShell on the Marketplace of Ideas, cultural conversation of the depth you demand. Now, we should we should draw a line here, I suppose, between certain types of film criticism, one type and another, because I talk to critics on this program, but they're people who write, they'll occasionally write an academic article, but they're people like Jonathan Rosenbaum was on recently, who's written academic stuff, and you can tell it's academic, but who's written popular, for lack of a better term, stuff. And was it purely the academic side you had thrown your brain into before this?
That's where I started. I mean, obviously there are very good film critics. I didn't mean to sort of be a little bit glib about that.
Oh no, but still, I want to make sure we know what we're talking about.
No, they're terrific film critics, and they're some of the academic stuff I read, is also quite good, and some of it, is I just could not understand, which has more to do with me, I'm sure than has to do with them, but. No, I didn't. I'm going to retract that. There are terrific film critics, just like there are terrific literary critics, and to think that the discourse is faulty is certainly unfair. So, but I will say that I did have a hard time. I did have a hard time constructing a character through film criticism, which is probably a salvation of the character.
And this is something I want to talk about because, obviously, I said you're a professor of English. You I would imagine have had to read a large amount of academic literary criticism, which comes in the public eye even for more of a beating than film criticism does.
Sure.
Right?
Yeah.
And just to get a sense of, I want to stick with the idea that you had a hard time building a character from film criticism, because I think both academic film criticism and academic literary criticism get criticized, if I want to keep using the word criticism, for some of the same reasons. Number one among them being that they're written from this sort of position of assumed objectivity. As you're writing about a book, but not necessarily, you might try to leave the reader out of it, as some do. You're writing about a movie, you might try to leave the individual, the specific viewer out of it. You're sort of separating your own reactions and trying to write about the viewer, capital T, capital V, not that they actually do that, but a sort of ideal viewer's reaction to the film. And first of all, let me get this straight. Is that a commonality you see between them, that there is that attempt to separate whoever actually was the viewer from the film itself?
I don't know. That's a good question. I think that I think to my mind, the best film critics and the best literary critics are the best writers. And criticism is simply, I won't say simply, but on some level, stories about other stories. And they're really good storytellers, and these storytellers are sometimes sort of inspired by film, and sometimes these storytellers are inspired by others, by literature. And oftentimes these, on really good criticism, these stories that the critics tell sort of allow you to see the film or the story in a new way, in a new and exciting way, and that's quite inspiring, and that's one could get these epiphanies about these things that we've read forever or seen forever, and go, wow, I never thought of that. I never thought that this is really what's on one level what's happening, and so that's the criticism that I find interesting. That these beautiful writers that allow me to see the object in new ways, and so I think that's what I think both good literature. That's what I think good critics are. Good, in a sense, good storytellers. Does that answer? I'm not sure I answered your question.
No, that's certainly it, and it's something I want to build on, because I'm always interested in reading and seeing and in absorbing film criticism or literary criticism that is itself formerly adventurous. And, part of the way through your novel, Arthouse, I started thinking of it as a work of film criticism, broadly defined. Of course, there's a chapter where Godard's film Contempt entraps the professor, and I think of Godard's many, many, many proclamations about how when he was making films, or when he makes a film, he's making film criticism. Like, he considers them the same thing. So did there come a point where you considered your novel Arthouse, or, I mean, any of the other novels you've written, a piece of criticism themselves?
I would say so, but not, that sort of, I mean, as you said, that if you say that to society, that's not going to be terribly advantageous, to them. I think that yes, I would say that especially perhaps Arthouse is a critical book, but actually, let me put it this way: I think novels or good fiction can, usually contain criticism, or usually sort of readings of other novels or readings of other things. And so I don't consider the two that separate, I suppose.
And the issue of containing criticism versus sort of embodying it, this gets awfully abstract, but I mean, maybe I can bring it down to earth a bit. Is it possible to make a good novel or a good film, do you think, that actually delivers criticism of its form, or does it have to always be implicit? I mean, does it have to just be a work of criticism by its very existence, by being different, or by manipulating some existing ideas about what the form should be?
I think all good books criticize themselves and criticize the books that come before them, but not criticize in the sense of a negative, just sort of critique, perhaps, or deal with or read. I think books, read themselves. I think books read previous books. This book reads film as well as previous books. I think from Don Quixote, books have read themselves, and that's part of their charm, I think.
Now, we mentioned something a little while ago that I think a listener who hasn't read the book might be scratching their head about, or might have been scratching their head about since, which is the presence of meth in this narrative. And because the book tells a story. It uses these films as stylistic inspirations for each chapter, but there's a through line. And, often the narrative that runs through this book struck me as incongruous in a good way with sort of the material of these films and the culture of these art house films. I mean, a lot of the story is like, it deals with elements of society and elements in places in America where the people who watch art house films don't often think about. Am I at all right about that? Right,
except but most of the films also deal. I mean, most of the sort of source films will deal with this. I mean,
right.
Fassbinder, for example, will certainly dealt with. Let's say he didn't deal with meth dealers, but if they'd have been around, he probably would have.
Right.
Godard, with Breathless. I mean, these are not high class sort of folk, and that's part of the charm of some of the directors. That is, I was struck by this, how few times we see sort of most of contemporary films. We're always in sort of upper class or at least upper middle class kitchens or upper middle class houses, or we're very seldom in anything like Italian realism of
right.
grit and dirt and poor people. The directors who made these films, oftentimes, at least certainly at the beginnings of their careers, dealt with the sort of low lives of society, whereas criminality seems today to be awfully stylized and usually white collar.
It is interesting to think about because you mentioned of course the fact that Breathless is about a criminal, and of course Fassbinder's films deal with a sort of lower stratum of society. But I seem to feel a difference between sort of the wastrels of those films, maybe just because you have to go back in time and go through this filter of cinema to see them. But I feel a difference between them and the meth dealers and meth heads of Pueblo, Colorado. You know what I mean? Yeah, no, that's and I guess I mean, you're exactly right. And the truth is that my figuring of the meth heads of Pueblo, Colorado is probably filtered much more through
Pasolini than through Pueblo, Colorado. I mean, I don't know anybody like this other than both through film and maybe sort of growing up in high school or something like that. But I didn't know people like this really in high school. I mean, their creation filtered through film. I have no real experience with these people by any means. So you're exactly right on some level, I think.
I don't have any experience with them either, so for all I know, it's a completely realistic portrayal of them. But I mean, I wonder though, is it just the fact? Do I feel differently about meth heads in sort of low population areas of Colorado because I know those people are the lower tier of society in our place and in our time right now? Whereas if I'm looking at the drug addicts that Fassbinder was evoking, or if I look at the romantic criminals of a Godard movie, I'm in a sense not looking at something real, even if they are based in reality, because it's too far away from me. I grew up in Washington State, where you could find a few meth heads. You didn't have to look too far, right?
Yeah,
so is it just a distance effect that might make a reader feel differently about these two types of low class?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I think I don't have an answer to that. That's a really interesting question. I think both are in a sense, creations, because we don't. Very few people likely who will read this book will have the opportunity to, know meth cooks who used to be in the army. I mean, I don't think that's a likely sort of whatever the sort of diagram you draw about sets. I don't think that there'd be a large place where they'd coincide. I think when we look at sort of people without hope in the past, we sort of give them hope. Oh, they will probably something happened where they will either, I don't know. I mean, as you say, they become romantic, whereas I don't think these characters are romantic, but likely because there's no possibility of transcendence. But I don't know one would have to think about the distance of time and what that allows, I think.
But speaking of the distance of time, I want to go back a little bit in your own writing history, because even somebody who reads Arthouse as the first Jeffrey DeShell novel that they've read, if they haven't read your other books yet, they can even just read about your previous books, or they can even just look at the titles, because they'll see your 1991 novel is called In Heaven, Everything is Fine. And that reference will not be lost on anybody who's even sort of into adventurous film. Obviously, David Lynch's Eraserhead, for those who haven't seen it. But I want to know how far back you go with, and I'll just go ahead and throw myself into the term Arthouse films, because you mentioned growing up without an art house, but when was the art house awakening, I suppose?
It wasn't very long ago. It was probably about 5 or 6 years ago.
Oh, really?
And one of the desires of writing this book was to teach myself about film.
It was 5 years ago, but you had the Lynch title in '91.
I'd seen movies, right? And but as far as knowing anything about them on any sort of systematic level, maybe 5, 6, 7 years ago. And then, it was a very sort of, I did it. I watched for 2 or 3 years. I watched two to three movies a day. I tried to make it.
Wow.
I tried to make it work. I mean, work as in labor. Not every day, but the days that I didn't teach or the summers, I would watch 2 to 3 films on my DVD player a day. I'd take fairly copious notes and try to make it. And I tried to make it somewhat systematic, and so it was fun. I mean, it was terrific. I mean, but I did. I hadn't seen many of these films. A few, but not many in a theater, or even though the University of Colorado has a terrific film studies program, only a few. It's not a lifelong passion. Maybe I shouldn't say that. Maybe I should make up another story because I seem like a dilettante. But it wasn't a lifelong passion.
But you found a way to escape dilettantism, because, like you said, you made it work. You had a system there, and that's what I think people look for when they read someone writing about film. They want to know that they are going to work in some sense, watching films in a systematic way, watching films even when they don't necessarily feel like it, doing some sort of systematic labor, even if it's enjoyable in the end. And it's one thing to watch 2 or 3 movies a day on a schedule, but now I have to know this. How did you figure out what to watch? Where did you begin? I mean, was this a process decide as you go, or you had a big map?
Oh no, I won't say I started with reference books, but certainly some films will suggest other films, right? I mean, almost automatically. That might suggest reference books, and then I might, for example, I fell in love with Gloria Graham. I won't say in love, but I first Gloria Graham, so I had to watch everything that she made. Then that probably led me to Bette Davis. I don't know, so I had to watch everything I could get my hands on with her, which then, so it went on from there and there and there. I mean, it was, then sometimes books would, history books, or I took film studies courses in in college, which gave me, I guess, a tiny little background. But as far as any sort of extensive knowledge, no, I didn't have that. But that's sort of the way I think I've worked a lot, with film or music or philosophy or anything like that. I guess things lead to other things, and a lot of things I would watch twice. At Showa, I watched I think 3 times. Béla Tarr, I watched 3 or 4 times. I lived in Hungary. I lived in Budapest, and I never saw Béla Tarr when I was in Budapest. Or never.
He didn't have a public presence even there.
He might have, but I didn't know about it.
Oh, I see.
And so I would have loved. I wish I would have known about it. I would have done more things, but. Yeah, I mean, things led to other things. But again, I feel a little guilty talking like it. I mean, it was study, but it was
yes.
It was incredibly enjoyable study. I mean, some of these films, the Godard, the Fassbinders. I mean, there's so many films that are just breathtaking, and you see why film became was incredibly important to everyone in the 60s and 70s. It just is amazing. The 40s and 50s, the 20s and 30s. It's breathtaking, the beauty and the sort of profundity of some of this. So yeah, it was great. even if no book resulted from it.
Well, who were the directors who you saw a few minutes of their films or a film or 2 of theirs, and you thought, okay, now I have to watch everything they've ever made? I mean, there had to be at least a few names who just grabbed you and made you essentially watch their filmography.
Yeah. Well, Fassbinder first. I mean, Fassbinder I did have some experience with for a while, and he was probably the first person to just, I guess, blow me away in that sense. Godard as well, because Godard would always walk a tightrope, and some of Godard's stuff is, I have to turn it off after 20 minutes because it's just, it's unwatchable. But some of it is just gorgeous, and so when it works, I mean, he's genuinely experimental because he's restless. He doesn't stop at things. He hasn't found any sort of formula and keep repeating it over and over again. I mean, there's always this attempt to see, what can I do now? What else can I do?
And with Godard movies, they feel current. I mean, I just saw a screening in LA recently of a 1980 film of his, translated in the U.S. as Every Man for Himself. I believe translated in other territories as Save Your Ass. But it's from 80, and it seemed like it could have been made this year, other than the look of it. His films tend to have sort of permanent novelty, you might say.
Yeah, and I wish I could remember which one it was that I watched it, and the DVD was screwed up. And so the background was all sort of staticky, and I didn't, until I watched the whole thing, not knowing that the DVD was screwed up, and thought, well, that's an interesting technique. And then I saw it again actually, I think it was playing at a French restaurant right. that I was walking by, or that we were eating lunch with or something, and. It was the background wasn't screwed up, and so I got another copy of the DVD, and I thought, so this is the way it's supposed to be. It's not supposed to be screwed up. There are many others that, Bergman, I mean, I just love, God is a spider. I mean, that's the story, right? I mean, and so there's Yeah, I mean, it was a very enjoyable couple, 2 or 3, 5 years of research. I mean, I did manage to go to the Contempt house, the Casa Malaparte, and as well as that suburb I was talking about. I did manage to visit. They were just extraordinary places. I mean, because they had that I had that resonance.
The fascinating thing about these types of films and the fact that you did this project of going through them is that, when you talk about them to people who haven't sort of had the same experience, haven't had a life of watching them, they will often consider them fairly forbidding, or movies that they'll put off or don't want to watch. But I'm reading Arthouse. I was thinking about the movies that are the chapters, thinking about, obviously The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, obviously Satyricon, but then I think, more about movies like The Conformist, Sátántangó, Tokyo Story, Contempt, and these are all very visceral movies. They're movies that can be enjoyed purely on a visceral level. You don't have to know anything to watch any of these movies. You don't have to know anything at all. I mean, do you agree with that?
No. No, it's sort of surprising. When people who've read this, they say, "Well, I haven't seen many of these movies," and on one hand, it surprises me, and it also sort of saddens me a little bit, because I think I sort of want to. On one hand, I think this book is a love letter, and I want to sort of say, watch these movies. I mean, I don't care if you read the book or not, but I mean, these movies are just. I want to share that sort of. Visceral, loving experience. That these are just terrific movies. I mean, whatever you think, I don't care about the book, but these movies are just wonderful, and I would hope that people would watch the films, because even the 7-hour Hungarian Sátántangó is for me, the 7 hours. Not, I don't remember if I've ever watched it at one time, but you do whatever the 7 hours are. I mean, they're gone in a second.
Right. I always forget to mention the 7 hours. In fact, we haven't brought them up till now, so that says something right there.
7 hours plus Hungarian, which when I was there, someone described listening to Hungarian language as like listening to someone fall down the stairs.
Oh my! So. Strong words. Strong words. There's the visceral element of all these movies, which I consider strong, but there's something else as well, and I don't quite know how to articulate it. But one of the most textually striking chapters in Arthouse is the chapter that takes its form, if you want to call it, takes its style from Yasujiro Ozu's Tokyo Story. And Ozu is one of my very favorite filmmakers. I can never resist a chance to watch one of his films, and I can't quite. It feels right to me the way that whatever you've translated about Ozu feels right to me in this chapter, but I don't know what it is. So how did you come to this form for Ozu?
I find Ozu, just camera, it's very sort of, obviously, the camera work is it's camera work, it's not work, where he puts his camera, and keeps it there. It's a very symmetrical and rectangular space, I think, and very limited. And so that was a basic game that I was playing. How do I make this rectangular and limited and stationary? And so it was, I'll tell you the trick. It's an easy, it was a fairly, I won't say it's cheating, but it was somewhat easy. 11 words, 11 lines, 11 pages. And so that was the limitation. And that really, again, it's also a way of getting out of in this case, the luridness of what's being described there. That that's the really violent gun battle, which is certainly I don't think you'll ever see in Ozu.
No, unlikely.
And so that was the game I played there. How to get that limitation and that stationary feeling. And so I did it in in some sense, a very literal or crude level of just keeping, the language.
And this is a subject that's come up on this show before, talking about literature, talking about modernism, talking about works of art that are, exciting in their construction. It always seems that the creators of those works had to find limitations and then work within them. But the step one was always finding the limitations. And here, you seem to have drawn limitations from films. But it's your fifth novel. Have you always found writing fiction to be something that flows from first finding the right set of limitations and then being able to go?
Yeah, in a way. I mean, it's a game. And so games have to have rules, and at least for me, games, rules, problems are all the same. And so, what problems can I solve, or what problem do I solve here? What game do I play here? What sort of limitations do I play here that are conscious? Because obviously I have an infinite number of limitations I'm either aware or not aware of.
As we all
These are more conscious, and oftentimes there are ways of, these limitations or games are ways of preventing things I really want to prevent. Usually that has to do with sentimentality or sort of easy answers or simplicity, I guess. And some people have different games. Some people are less conscious about their games. Some people are more conscious about their games. That's my game.
And all but one of these films has itself prevented sentimentality, so you had a high bar to reach.
Yeah, right. Yeah, that's it. Yeah, that's exactly right. Except a man and a woman.
Well,
although Anuka May is certainly. Both the characters are gorgeous. It's just that damn song that
I will resist splicing the song into the end of this conversation, but the temptation is very strong. I've been speaking with Jeffrey DeShell, Associate Professor of English at the University of Colorado Boulder, and he's the author of 5 novels, the most recent of which is Arthouse. Jeffrey, thanks so much for taking the time today.
Oh, thank you for a very stimulating and interesting conversation. I appreciate this very much.
This has been The Marketplace of Ideas, and I've been Colin Marshall. Want to hear this conversation with Jeffrey DeShell again? Visit colinmarshallradio.com or go on iTunes and search for The Marketplace of Ideas. Either way, you'll get the complete podcast archive of The Marketplace of Ideas. Any interview, anytime, always completely free. Questions, comments, guest suggestions, send them to Colin, COLIN, at colinmarshallradio.com. The website of The Man Who Makes Our theme music, Ben Althouse, is available, by the way, at benalthouse.com. And if you want to get weekly updates on all things Marketplace of Ideas, about current and upcoming interviews, as well as related internet interestingness, just visit colinmarshallradio.com, and on the front page of the Marketplace of Ideas section, you'll find the complete instructions, and complete is even overstating it. They're very, very simple, very easy stuff to sign up for the Marketplace of Ideas mailing list. Thanks as always for listening. We'll catch you next week for more cultural conversation of the depth you demand on the Marketplace of Ideas.